Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. Well, I'm coming at you live from New York City. It is the first Braver Angels podcast of 2022. I'm joined by my longtime friend, collaborator, partner, fellow mischief maker, John Wood Jr. John, it's good to be back on the mic with you. How you doing?
I'm doing good, brother. I'm doing good. I want to let you know, Karen, that I respect your scarf game, brother. I respect the neck gear, and you're looking good, man. It's good to see you in the new year.
Yes, for those of you who are listening to this as an audio podcast instead of on YouTube, you'll be pleased to know that we're both wearing scarves. And the reason for that is that John's taken to wearing a lot of fashionable scarves, and I felt envious. So I put on a scarf myself. It's actually a keffiyeh that I picked up in Jerusalem. I don't know if I'm going to keep it on for the whole episode because my neck is starting to get a little bit toasty. But for now, it feels very comfortable. And I'm really excited for today's episode to get back on the mic with you, John, to talk a little bit about the current state of American politics, where Braver Angels has been, where we seek to go, and how we are trying to hold America together in what feels like an increasingly perilous moment for our nation, for our ideals, for our democracy, and for our very collective civic and mental, for that matter, health. So today is Wednesday, January 5th. Tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of January 6th and the events that took place on January 6th. We'll probably be releasing this a day or two after. But as we come up on January 6th, I wanted to step back and reflect on the meaning of that day now that we have a year of perspective. So let me first just start, John, with your reaction to the events of that day, both intellectual and philosophical, but also emotional.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I'll start with the latter part. I mean, emotionally, that day for me, and other people have said similar things, but for me, January 6th, and I'll tell you that it just so happened to be the case that I was enduring COVID 19 at the time. I had contracted COVID at the very beginning of 2021, or maybe at the very end of 2020, and I was at just about my sort of nadir with it when I was actually going back and forth with you, if I recall, on Slack, and you were messaging me. I was not supposed to be working, but I was trying to, and you were messaging me to turn on the TV, and I finally did. And I was sick, I was tired, I already was feeling depressed, and turning on the TV and seeing that, it just felt unreal. I thought that I was looking at, it felt like I was, watching, some really terrible scene from some very implausible movie. And it was depressing, man. Depressing in a deep and bitter way. I mean, truly, 9/11 would be the only other thing I could quickly compare it to in terms of the visceral effect it had on me, in terms of feeling like, something, this country, which is, sacred to me, and our democracy, which is sacred to me, is under attack viscerally. And I just had deep and bitter feelings about it in that moment, as did, many people, I think, right and left. Now, to sort of pull back a little bit, January 6th did not mark the end of democracy. You can look at it different ways to a certain degree. On the one hand, you can perhaps try to minimize it by saying, look, this was an unfortunate thing that happened because you had a group of folks who got rowdy at a political event and simply took things too far. But we don't need to think about it much further than that. Or you can look at this as being something that occurred as the manifestation of a larger campaign of misinformation, that itself is something that has unfolded in the context of a larger societal phenomenon of deep institutional distrust, partisan distrust, wherein people don't know what's real anymore and are lashing out in violence to try and, I think, from their vantage point, uh, protect what they think is the actual truth in American democracy. Um, I mean, putting my cards on the table, I've had good conversations with folks who believe that the election was stolen in 2020. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that there are is something of a cynical, campaign that was put forward to push people's opinions in that direction that capitalized on the distrust that they felt towards the left in general and major American institutions. Distrust that I think is also, genuinely sort of valid, in many, many respects. But that the response that we have to be committed to this has to go beyond just sort of fact checking and so on and so forth. It really does have to get back to our being able to rehabilitate our own capacity to communicate with each other as Americans and to reason together on the basis of some mutual trust and goodwill. And so that's the Braver Angels project. And whatever side of the election question you fall on, you know it's one that we have to work diligently to enlist all Americans in, or at least Americans from each side of the aisle and from across the spectrum, wherever you may land on the question of 2020 and other very important issues.
Hmm. Yeah, a couple of things I'm thinking about when I reflect. The first is the context of January 6th. So it wasn't just an ordinary day, it was the day on which the Senate would certify the state results of the election that would officially declare Joe Biden as the winner. And obviously, President Trump and members of his inner circle had been mounting a campaign to do whatever they could to obstruct that peaceful transfer of power. They launched all sorts of frivolous lawsuits that were dismissed by courts across the country, eventually dismissed by the Supreme Court. There were some charges of not necessarily Trump himself, but Trump supporters threatening elected officials. And I think that your point is well taken. I think the vast majority of people who stormed the Capitol did truly believe President Trump when he told them over and over that the election had been stolen from him, from them, that our democracy was being torn apart by the left, by the institutions that serve the interests of the left. And so it's an interesting question. People fall victim to cynical efforts to manipulate the narrative. And I think a lot of folks saw themselves as patriots who were doing what they had to do to try to protect the country and protect the movement of which they're a part. I think it's also interesting to think about the narrative that has emerged post January 6th. And I'm very troubled by how politicized it's become. I think in the immediate wake of the event, there seemed to be a bipartisan sobering consensus that something bad had happened to American democracy that transcended the typical partisan scrum, that we had not only come inches away to a constitutional crisis, but the sacred heart of American democracy had been violently breached and desecrated. And, you had the Republican House Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, on the floor of representatives, uh, laying blame for the riots at the feet of Donald Trump. A striking thing to hear a Republican leader say. You had Mitch McConnell delivering an impassioned speech about the importance of certifying the electoral votes. But within a few weeks, the narrative began to change. And Republicans who continued to want to look into January 6th, to hold people accountable for January 6th, became outcasts in the Republican Party. Liz Cheney, for example, was one of the few Republicans who committed herself to leading the effort to get to the bottom of what happened and to hold folks accountable who broke the law. She was ostracized, stripped of her committee assignments, and a year later, it's almost become dogma among leaders of the Republican Party to downplay the gravity of what happened, and also to embrace conspiracy theories around Stop the Steal. And it's remarkable the extent to which President Trump has been able to consolidate power and establish himself once again as sort of the de facto leader of the Republican Party. And I worry that when something like January 6th becomes politicized, it also might become normalized. There's a chance that it could be a pretext for further violence and further conflict that tears us apart and renders one of the core facets of democracy, which is the vote, itself polarized and called into question. And I think it's interesting that in the lead up to January 6th, Braver Angels released a public letter called Holding America Together, which specifically asked Americans, regardless of who they were going to vote for in the presidential election, to sign on to commit to reject violence and to protect the peaceful transfer of power. In many ways, I think the letter was prescient. Unfortunately, it didn't protect us from what happened. So I'm curious to hear, what do you think about the narrative of January 6th after the fact? Because I think that it's easy for people to try to rewrite history. And at a time when people understand information based on confirmation bias, do you think that it could open the doors for further violence in 2022 and the more and more common justification of violence to protect American ideals?
Yeah, well, I think that there's more than one narrative about January 6th at this point, even on the right. I mean, I think that there is a sort of there's an instinct to sort of minimize the event in a way that doesn't just seek to put it in some kind of larger context, but that seeks to sort of absolve various individuals of responsibility. Most notably, President Trump. And I mean, here I guess it's important for me to just be forthright in terms of how I look at Trump's involvement in this. My feeling is that I don't think that President Trump realized or knew what was going to happen. Although maybe there's some information I'm not aware of or something that's going to come out in these current inquiries that says otherwise. But I mean, to me, it just seems clear that President Trump did not intend for people to attack the Capitol physically, but that nevertheless he was galvanizing people and poking and prodding them on the basis of claims that I think are not just untrue, but that many people knew to not be true, in a way that just got completely out of hand, right? And so to me, it seems like gross irresponsibility, gross negligence in terms of leadership. And you got many people who, at least some people on the right, who will make the claim that there's no responsibility, there's no fault to be laid at the feet of the president or others, who weren't just speaking in very energetic, animated sort of language at the rally itself, but who were putting forward, the storylines about voter theft prior to. And for me, it's very, very, very difficult for me to find agreement with that position. Now you've got other people who, again, will say that this is something that happened. This is something that was a terrible event and a terrible moment in American politics and American history. But on the right, you'll have people like Ben Shapiro, who I was just listening to on this point yesterday, say, do not let that distract you from the fact that the mainstream media and the political left has been, in many respects, complicit, or at least fostering, facilitating of civil unrest and civil violence in America for the last few years, far more to far greater impact than anything Donald Trump has done. And to make that case, folks will point to the summer of protests following the death of George Floyd, folks will point to the really very, very intense demonstrations that destroyed a lot of property in D.C. itself. And I'm trying to, I guess this would have been 2017, even before the George Floyd protests. I mean, trying to recall now. We've had so many of these sorts of incidents, and I've got some sympathy for some of that because, I mean, as a person who's very concerned with how we talk about race in America, I mean, one thing that I know from polling data is that you've got many people who think that law enforcement in America kill unarmed African American men by the thousands in this country every year, and of course it's an absolutely sort of grossly inaccurate and ballooned statistic that people nevertheless believe, because we oftentimes fail to take real tragedies and real sort of markers perhaps of police brutality, like the death of George Floyd, and we use it to paint a picture of something that's like quasi-genocidal in terms of the relationship between police and unarmed black men. And how could that not set the pretext for some degree of violence, such as what we saw in some of the protests that unfolded in the aftermath of that? Now, is that an apples to apples or an apples to oranges comparison between January 6th? That's its own conversation. But you asked me about the narratives that are unfolding on the right, and I think that the tension that we see is between some folks who want to sort of absolve, former President Trump of any responsibility in this, and to make this seem like it was really nothing more than a tragic accident, right? Versus people who want to say, yes, this was a shameful moment, something that was a consequence of rhetoric and perhaps also misguided or manipulative claims about what had happened in the 2020 election. But that also, this is something that occurred in the larger context of the left manipulating American politics in a way that has also led to violence for which nobody wants to take responsibility, and that this is being used as a further pretext to sort of color the entire conservative movement, the entire Republican Party, as if each and every Republican were somebody who was, charging up the steps of the Capitol, breaking windows, when really this is the fringest, the fringe of the fringe of people, who describe themselves as conservatives or otherwise support, the politics of the right. And so, I think this is something of the spectrum of views that we're seeing come in the aftermath of, January 6th, and that I think we'll see continue.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I think on the final point, one of my concerns is that the view is becoming more mainstream
Mhm.
on the right, justifying the use of force to protect what you think is right. And I think nowhere is that more true than the fact that Trump continues to be the power center and the kingmaker, and likely I would say the 2024 nominee.
Well, yeah,
And
and I'm sorry, because you did ask me, do I think this will lead to more violence? And just very quickly on that point, I think that what will lead to more violence is a situation in which Americans really and truly believe that the electoral system is not, legitimate, right? Because then people have, if there's no, if in people's minds at least, there's no legitimate pathway towards expressing and having their, preferences counted in the democratic process, if they think that there's no legitimate pathway towards, participating in self-government, violence becomes the only tool you have available at that point to confront a corrupted system or to make yourself feel heard. And so, if we can't sort of, depolarize and elevate, our confidence ultimately, in democracy, in the way the system works, it's hard to see how people won't find great appeal in potentially taking up arms in response to what they see as the capture of American democracy. So yeah, I think it's something to be concerned about.
have you seen our work in depolarization open up the space to counter some of the false conspiracy theories that are leading tens of millions of people, I think, to believe that the vote is no longer trustworthy?
Well, I think that as a matter of principle, um, our work is not about our work is not about creating the space to counter, one conspiracy theory or the other, but rather about setting the context for communication within which, through trust in one another, we can open our minds to points of view that we were not engaging or entertaining before. And people see
Right.
that as presenting, positive opportunities and also, risks, right? Because you'll have some people say, okay, well, I like the idea of the other person opening up his or her mind to what I have to say, but I'll be damned if I want people who agree with me today to suddenly hear a claim like the election was stolen from somebody who's misinformed or lying, but who's charismatic and and presses a bunch of emotional buttons, and suddenly we're losing more people to misinformation. That's a concern we get presented with quite a bit. Now, I've never been too worried about that, honestly, because what I think, what I think our methods accomplish is putting people in a position to where they can reason together and engage with evidence together. And ultimately, I tend to think that when something is true, the more clear-minded we are in assessing the facts and the context of the facts that that represent the different pieces of the reality that we're trying to understand, that we naturally tend to converge around the things that are genuinely true when our reasoning is no longer sort of chiefly spurred by emotions such as resentment, fear, contempt, and cynicism. Right? I think
Mm-hmm.
that those things tend to get filtered out of the reasoning process and the communication process more and more in our methods, and as such, I think it optimizes people's ability to reason together as we build relationships with and trust in one another, right? And so, in that broad sense, yes, I mean, as a person who thinks that and I agree with my friend, Wilfred Riley, I should say, by the way, a conservative political scientist from Kentucky University with the 1776 Unites project, etc. Who made the point that he doesn't think that the election was on this podcast made the point that he doesn't think the election was stolen at the ballot box, but that nevertheless he thinks that social media companies and mainstream media platforms and other powerful institutions sought to tip the scales in the direction of the Biden campaign. But I think that methods that frameworks that allow people to engage one another soberly on facts and issues allow people ultimately to reason their own way to the truth. When you put the emotional kind of aspect of it to the side long enough for them to do that, and I think it also creates space for people to understand the larger context in terms of why people may come to believe some of these sorts of claims in the first place. When I think a lot of people have difficulty understanding how anybody could believe claims like that coming from Donald Trump and his allies at the moment, both of which are things I hope happen.
Hmm.
Mm.
Well, as we look back on the year that was, we also had a new president who took office shortly after January 6th. I think he'll be coming up on his 1 year anniversary in office in a couple weeks. When he first came into office, he seemed to be riding high. People were hopeful for a change. They were hopeful that the pandemic would begin to recede, that the economy would come roaring back. Fast forward 12 months, and Biden seems to be in the doldrums. His approval rating is quite low, similar to where Trump's was for most of his presidency. He's been drawing criticism, not just from the right, but from the left. I think I've seen a lot of criticism of Biden in mainstream outlets. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, which resulted in the killing of 13 service members, was obviously roundly criticized. And he also held a almost mission accomplished like event in July when it seemed like the pandemic was on the downswing, where he, on Independence Day, tried to claim independence from the virus. We know what happened next. The Delta variant came. Now the Omicron variant has come. People seem exhausted. I think they're rightfully critical of the government's inability to make COVID testing easy and accessible 2 years into the pandemic. On the other hand, Joe Biden was able to pass a major bipartisan infrastructure bill. He was able to restore to the office, I think, a certain sense of honor and civility, and to prioritize truth as much as is possible in politics, where truth is often bent to serve needs. So, what's your impression of Joe Biden's first year in office?
Well, my impression is that the Manchin Cinema administration has really made some powerful moves in American politics and has defined the the course of things in Washington in pretty conspicuous ways. As far as the Biden Harris administration, it's hard for me to say the same. I mean, you mentioned that there was a significant infrastructure bill passed, and that's true. And that, I think, had long been looked at as something of the low-hanging fruit in terms of possible, bipartisan legislation that could move through Washington. But, overall, even though, on the headline level, the unemployment rate is low, and the administration will boast certain successes, I think that the way people feel is that the COVID-19 pandemic is still driving or has still got a grip on American life in a way that makes people think that things may never return to normal in the way folks want them, in the way that folks want them to. I think that many people who are concerned with voting rights and social justice feel stymied and frustrated at the fact that President Biden is not able ultimately to get those legislative goals across the finish line. I think that Americans left, right, and center were just appalled by the pullout of Afghanistan. Even many people who agreed with President Biden. That was probably most Americans. I think that was most Americans, that we should ultimately, leave the country. But the way it happened just was so chaotic and seemed to have been so incompetently done. It brought with it so much tragedy, both for the servicemen who died, but also, of course, for the Afghan people themselves. Um, all of this, coupled with the fact that President Biden, he is the oldest, you know, elected president of the United States that we have ever had, and he comes across as elderly. It doesn't mean that he's not in his right mind. It doesn't mean that he's in the grips of senility and so on and so forth. I mean, I think it's possible to exaggerate all that, but what it does mean is that in a moment where Americans, I think, are desperately looking for clarity and direction and kind of a vigorous sort of leadership, I don't think people feel that from the White House. I think that for many people, even many supporters of President Biden's, I think that there's a sense that he is sort of, something of a caretaker in the Oval Office. And so, there's something of a vacuum there on the level of leadership, which is part of what has many people, nervous that President Trump may still have an opening, right? To return. Now, I think that's a big question mark. I don't know if that's probable, but then again, people didn't think Trump would be elected in the first place, and you're right. Donald Trump is still the kingmaker in the Republican Party. His influence in the party has not waned, not really. Even as there are, stiff pockets of resistance. And so it just places the country in general in a great state of uncertainty, right? Because it seems like the visions of leadership that we have are sort of relatively weak on the other hand, and perhaps wild and crazy on the other. At least I think that's probably where many, if not most, Americans would probably come down on Biden versus Trump. And there is just this big question as to where the country is going. And again, in the midst of all that, the American people aren't getting along with each other, losing our faith in her institutions. And so, it is a moment of deep uncertainty, I think, for the American people. And I don't think that the Biden administration has been able to remedy that feeling as of yet.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think in some ways, Biden and his administration overpromised. They came into office with a whole suite of grand plans to remake our social safety system. There were people who said that Biden was going to be a transformational president. They talked in comparative terms with FDR and all that he was able to accomplish after World War II. And it's become clear that Biden will not be a transformational president. He's run headlong into the filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats still need 60 votes in the Senate to overcome Republican obstruction to all sorts of legislation, including the voting rights bill that has been put forth that Joe Manchin did support. However, I don't think Manchin nor several other Democratic senators would be open to discarding the filibuster or carving out an exception to pass a piece of legislation like voting rights, which isn't considered a reconciliation budget bill. And that's why Biden was hoping that he could pass a reconciliation bill that invested in human infrastructure, as well as sweeping legislation to address climate change and Medicare and paid family leave. And I think Democrats have also run into the fact that Joe Manchin is quite conservative, and understandably so. The Democrats are lucky to have Joe Manchin. If Joe Manchin didn't exist, it's almost certain that there would be 2 Republican senators from West Virginia. Joe Manchin managed to get reelected as a Democrat in a state that I think went for Trump by like 30 points, which is almost a miraculous feat of political maneuvering. And so I've been a little bit disappointed that the Democrats believe they could somehow pressure Manchin into accepting terms that he was pretty clear he was not willing to accept. And it seems that they've managed to piss him off now. And I'm not sure that that's going to help bring him back to the table, but I am hopeful that they'll be able to get something passed, because if they don't, I think they're going to have a hard time at the midterm elections making a case that they've accomplished what they set out to do. And I'm not sure how successful simply running against Trump will be. I think you saw in the Virginia gubernatorial race, Terry McAuliffe, his strategy seemed to be, I'm not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is bad, so vote for the Democrats. And that guy Youngkin came in and really seized on the energy that was animating voters, which was related to schools and children and masking and critical race theory. And so I think it's hard for Democrats to settle on a united message because their coalition is so broad. You know, you have the AOC crowd, you have center-left Democrats, you have coalitions of people of color, you have a decreasing amount of sort of old school union white Democrats. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Well, and who are jousting with each other. I mean, within the larger sort of left-leaning constituency on issues that are, you know, deep and personal to all Americans that we don't feel like we have much sense of larger direction on. I mean, I'm thinking about in Chicago, where Mayor Lori Lightfoot is right now sort of at odds with the teachers union, which wants to push forward with virtual schooling still in the advent of Omicron, right? Which is highly transmissible. The number of cases of Omicron are surging, but people will counter that fact by saying yes, but it does not seem to be as deadly, does not seem to be as dangerous, and kids need to go back to school. And Mayor Lightfoot made the case that parents, you can't just give them 2 weeks notice and say you got to start homeschooling this time. People need to work jobs. People need to live their lives and take care of their families, and they can't upend their lives when teachers have an obligation to teach in person if circumstances can allow for it. And the teachers union responds by saying, but we do not feel safe in these classrooms. And in the midst of all of this, it seems to me like a lot of the leadership that has come forward from various people, you know, not only, but I think including President Biden, although I noticed, I think Kamala Harris has begun to speak in gentler tones. But you rewind the clock a little bit, and, you know, you recall President Biden, very sort of, you know, in a very kind of rough way, you know, making the case that, you know, the unvaccinated are irresponsible, the unvaccinated are putting us at risk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, these are understandable sentiments, right? I mean, I don't blame any Americans who are vaccinated, who believe that we need to be complying, with the mandates and so on and so forth, from feeling that way. But in a moment where it is objectively true that government power is asserting itself, in the private sector and various other places in the educational system to try and get people to comply with the policies that can protect us on the level of health, it seems to make it doubly and triply important that we speak empathetically to the concerns of all Americans, not, whether we're talking about white conservative Trump supporters or people of color who, for historical reasons, mistrust the medical establishment. And Ciaran, of course, you hosted an awesome podcast with a Trump supporter and Black Lives Matter leader who were talking about their respective reasons for their skepticism, along with a health professional who was laying out some of the facts for them to consider. But empathetic leadership is necessary to building coalitions both within parties and especially between parties. And again, that's just what fails to come forward, in our national life. And it's funny because Joe Biden, I think, is actually, his own native personality. I think Joe Biden is actually an empathetic guy. I think that Joe Biden is somebody who's been criticized in the past for being too friendly with Republicans and so on and so forth. And now, of course, he's in this moment where predictably he's being tarred as somebody who's capitulated to the far left. And, he is pushing policies that are to the left, I think, of where many Americans are on certain issues. And the COVID policy is probably the best example of it. But all of that, although, infrastructure, soft infrastructure spending, we can go down a list. It doesn't matter, though. Even if a bill fails to pass, the question is, do we have a vision of how it is the American people can come together on the things that really matter, our commitment to each other and our ability, right, to support each other, whether a bill, goes up or down. I mean, I think that, leadership has to establish a sense of hope, a sense of optimism that can outlast a certain, debate on Capitol Hill. And, but it is so hard to find that in this moment. And that's why, to be honest, a lot of that's got to come from the American people themselves. It's got to come from people listening to this podcast. It's got to come from people, working in local and state government. It's got to come from people in the educational system. We have to reach out to each other so that the culture we create in American civil society can bubble up to the level of our leadership, right? And make it possible for people to seek to lead all of the American people rather than trying to carve out a faction that can tip the balance, 51 versus 49 or what have you, whether in Congress or whether in nationally or in a congressional district or what have you. We've got to get to that point to where we can bring the American people together in a vision of what our future could be.
Yeah, and it will be particularly interesting to see what happens if Biden chooses not to run for re-election and there's an open primary in the Democratic field.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that a strong voice could emerge that could bring that sense of vigor and vibrancy without, again, dividing people. But it's tough. And I think that January 6th was kind of a line in the sand for some Democrats who said, my colleagues on the other side are threatening my life. They are supporting people who came to Congress who were chanting, "Where's Nancy Pelosi? Hang Mike Pence."
Right.
And then, of course, you have some of the, real far right House Republicans, saying some scary stuff, calling Ilhan Omar a terrorist, using language that can really, posting anime videos of them like shooting their fellow Congress people. And so it's tough when it gets to the point where you really feel like someone is using language that puts you at risk.
Well, and this is why, the Republican Party has at least as great a, responsibility and obligation here to put forward leadership that also seeks to genuinely, unite the American people, or at least to speak to the experiences and the fears of people who are not just nested, within the base of the GOP, right? Because I mean, the Republican Party has helped. The Republican Party has taken a leading role in fostering these fears and divisions, even if it was in response, for many people, to all sorts of fears and manipulations that we as Republicans may see as coming from the left. That's all well and good, but at a certain point, we've got to start thinking about the country collectively. We've got to start thinking about the nation as a whole. And Democrats have every right, I think, to be fearful, of the Republican Party, be fearful of Donald Trump. Certain fears I may think have been exaggerated and artificially put forward by cynical interests, by folks in the media, and so on and so forth. But other fears, other concerns, I think are wholly legitimate and based in some realities. But whether you agree with somebody's fear or not, at a certain point, it's sort of not even the point. It's sort of not even the issue, right? We
Hmm.
have to gain one another's trust, and that comes through good faith. So if you look at something like voting rights and so forth, I think that there's a case to be made, a real case to be made that says that, some people want to paint like the modern South and the modern Republican Party and people who are pushing certain, voting, reforms and so forth as following in the legacy of abject sort of Jim Crow segregation and oppression. And I think that that's sort of a gross exaggeration. I mean, I think that there's a case to be made for, strong case to be made for voter ID and certain policies. But when you see, things being put forward, like, putting, shortening voting hours on Sundays and so forth. I mean, there are things that you can see in some of the reforms here that do smack with echoes of the longer sort of legacy of voter suppression that has characterized the reality of African American democratic participation in this country's existence, going back, till the very aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction and so forth. And when you consider the fact that that's how people who have suffered under that history are inevitably going to look at changes to our voting system that are coming from certain places, that are coming out of southern governments and from the party that is based in the South and so forth, and in the context of these larger sort of what seems to be disinformation campaigns about modern American elections. It is important to empathize with those concerns and to show, if you can show, how it is that your policies do not perpetuate a legacy of discrimination. As Republicans, we got to take responsibility for making that case if we can legitimately make that case, right? Rather than just complaining about the fact that we are being mischaracterized and tarred and feathered and so forth by the other side. That's always going to happen. It doesn't change the reality of what leadership calls for in a pluralistic society. And again, I'd say similar things about, how Democrats ought to be leaning from the left and so forth. But yeah, man. But the good news is that I think that there's a braver way forward. I mean, I think that there is a way in which we can actually depolarize the culture of our politics. Even building on some of the great work that the bridge building music movement and Braver Angels itself has done to date.
Yes. Well, that brings me to my last point in these last 5 minutes here. Let's discuss a bit what's in store for Braver Angels, because looking back at the past year politically, there's certainly a lot of doom and gloom, but Braver Angels is a light in the darkness, and we are an ever-growing American family that is bringing that light to their communities, their families, and soon to their elected officials. As some listeners might have gotten wind of, we'll be launching soon the full-scale Braver Politics Initiative, which is an effort to take what's worked for us at the grassroots level in our citizen to citizen work and bring it into the political arena to directly engage and bring together across the divide both elected officials and candidates. And we are trying to scale this program over the course of the next few months so that we can be prepared to be that light in the last few months of the campaign season, which is certain to be bitter and divisive, and to become a real agent of influence in politics so that we're not only influencing individuals, but also influencing institutions and creating a virtuous cycle that can push back against the vicious cycle that we've been caught up in for so long. And
Mm.
so I'm really excited about Braver Politics. I'm excited to use this podcast as a way to advance Braver Politics in the conversation, maybe try to get some elected officials to come on, elected officials who disagree on policy, but agree on the need to have these lines of communication. And the second big thing I'm thinking about is the upcoming Braver Angels National Convention,
Yep.
which will be our first convention since pre-COVID times. We'll be bringing together hundreds of Braver Angels leaders of all walks of life from across the country. We'll have thousands more joining online, leaders, funders, partners, media. I think it's going to be a really special event, and you'll be hearing a lot more about the convention in our communications to come. So before we jump off here, John, what are you looking forward to in 2022, and what's giving you hope rather than despair?
Mhm. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to the things that you mentioned. I mean, it's already been inspiring to see members of Congress participating in our workshops and opening up the door for Braver Angels to begin to have a deeper impact on our national legislature, the culture of Congress. So, look, there's hard work to be done there, but through the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress and the work and outreach of Bill Doherty, yourself, and other leaders at Braver Angels, we've begun to establish something of a toehold in D.C. That we intend to allow us to begin to elevate the spirit of our politics in Washington. But of course, the excitement goes far beyond that because it's really about the state legislatures. It's really about local city councils, school boards that are currently, riven by, fights and wars over, critical race theory or the perception of critical race theory and what have you. So the idea that, working with incredible, partner organizations who, we'll be talking about and who listeners will learn more about soon, that we could begin to build out, this infrastructure of relationship building and depolarization, across in governments, federal, state, and local across the country, is just wildly exciting. While it's also, going to be a lot of work, and so we invite each and every one of you to help us push that boulder up the hill, up and over, so we can get it to roll down on the other side. And so I hope people take advantage of opportunities to volunteer. So, if you're not a member, join as a member. You'll get to hear more. Also excited about the convention, excited about partying it up if it's, whether in person or virtual or maybe a little bit of both. Things are coming together, but I'm very much looking forward to that. And also just looking forward to doing more to tell the story of Americans who are willing to see each other as human beings and to reach out across the divide, even though it's painful, even though it's tough, even though it requires us having humility while also having the courage to speak from our convictions. But I think that there's so much we can do, especially now that we have incredible, leadership on the storytelling front with the brilliant and animating Monica Guzman. But, the bench of talent at Braver Angels continues to expand. And I think this podcast, I think articles and essays and video products that we will be producing, collaborations possibly with other media groups, is going to give us an example to shine a light on this broader bridge building sort of movement in American life and the larger Braver Angels community that I think is going to show people an inspiring alternative in terms of what the culture of American democracy could look like versus what it has looked like and what it may seem to look like in so many places in this current moment. So I'm looking forward, my friend, to all of that and to working with you, Mr. O'Connor, and, maybe even getting back out on some college campuses and, talking to some students and visiting some communities, shaking some hands, getting back on the campaign trail with you, man. But if we do that, brother, we got to make sure that, we keep coordinating on the scarf front, especially as it gets kind of cold in some of these northeastern states. So I'm looking forward to all of that.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm also looking forward to the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some big things in store, a lot of guests we want to get on, maybe play out with some interesting formats. So you'll be hearing a lot more. Keep tuning into the Braver Angels podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe. Shoot us listener feedback at media@braverangels.org. And we will talk to you soon.